The message crackled through Earth's communication channels like a thunderclap, shaking the very airwaves of every military base, government office, and civilian network. It was simple, direct, and terrifying. I am Varnok, champion of a galactic empire. I challenge the strongest human to face me in single combat. Your species is weak, your warriors are soft. Show me your best, or kneel to my might. For 3 days, the message repeated across every corner of Earth's broadcasting systems. The sheer audacity of it left humanity in shock. Who was this alien, this self-proclaimed champion of an empire that spanned across the stars? And why did he single out Earth in such a bold challenge? The world's leaders convened in a tense summit. The United Nations, the European Union, the Pacific Alliance, every governing body was represented. The urgency was palpable. If this was a trick, it could spell disaster. But if this was real, Earth would have to face an enemy unlike any other in its history. The question that gnawed at everyone's mind was clear. Who could face this alien warrior? In the heart of a war room, Commander Lucas Ray, a battle-hardened strategist, clenched his fists as the screen flickered with images of Varnok. The alien was massive, easily 8 feet tall, clad in armored plating that seemed forged from the very stars themselves. His eyes gleamed with an unsettling certainty, his posture radiating years of brutal training and unshakable confidence. "The guy's insane," muttered General Cole. "No one can fight him and live. Hell, his record is legend. He's undefeated across galaxies." Ray's gaze remained fixed on the screen. "If we decline, they'll call us weak. If we accept, well, it's not just a fight. It's an ultimatum." "Exactly," Cole said grimly. "This challenge is a declaration of war. But we need someone who can at least survive a few seconds against him. Maybe give us time to figure something out." That's when it happened. The voice of Sergeant Connor Blake, a decorated soldier with the elite special forces, cut through the tension like a blade. "I'll do it." The room went silent. All eyes turned toward Blake, who had spoken with unshaken resolve. He stood at the back, arms crossed, his face unreadable. He was a lean figure, his uniform pressed sharply, his expression one of quiet determination. "You're insane," Cole shot back, her voice a mix of disbelief and concern. "This isn't just some alien thug. This is a champion. An entire empire built around his image. What could you possibly think you could do?" Blake stepped forward, his eyes meeting hers without a hint of hesitation. "I'm not going to let Earth cower in front of anyone. If we let this go unanswered, they'll see us as prey. I won't let that happen." He could feel the weight of their stares, the crushing responsibility of the challenge pressing on him. But Blake had always been driven by something beyond duty. He had been in the heat of battle more times than he could count, and against odds that would make anyone else tremble. This was no different. Ray studied him carefully, seeing the fire in Blake's eyes that few others possessed. "It's not just about surviving, Blake. If you go, you'll be a symbol of humanity's defiance or its extinction. There's no middle ground." "I know the stakes, sir," Blake replied, "but I can't stand by while we let someone else decide our fate. I'm in." The room fell into a tense silence. No one spoke for a long moment, as if waiting for something to shift, something to change. Finally, Commander Ray nodded slowly. "Then it's settled. Sergeant Blake will face Varnok. But know this, you're not just fighting for your life. You're fighting for humanity's future." Blake stood still, his pulse steady as he absorbed the weight of his decision. His life was now bound to a challenge that would either mark humanity's greatest victory or its most crushing defeat. As he turned to leave the room, he felt the eyes of a world pressing down on him, watching his every move. The challenge had been thrown. Earth had no choice but to answer. The fate of humanity now rested on the shoulders of one soldier. And in the coming days, Blake would learn that Varnok wasn't just a warrior. He was a force of nature. The day Blake boarded the shuttle to the Empire's capital, he felt an unnerving stillness settle over him. There was no grand farewell, no heroic send-off. Just the hum of engines and the silence of those who knew what he was about to face. He sat alone in the cockpit, staring out at the stars as Earth's atmosphere slowly thinned away. His mind was a tangle of thoughts, but there was one clear truth. He had made his choice. And now, there was no turning back. The Empire had made it clear. Varnok awaited him. But what neither Blake nor Earth's leaders understood was how much of this challenge was just the beginning. What came next would either elevate humanity to a level few could imagine, or see it crushed under the boot of a galactic empire that never knew defeat. Blake wasn't just fighting for his own survival. He was fighting for Earth's place in a universe that viewed humanity as little more than a curiosity. Weak, primitive, unworthy of notice. Varnok's challenge wasn't just an insult. It was a warning to all who would stand against the Empire's might. Blake had accepted it because he believed in one thing: humanity's ability to surprise, to fight when it made no sense, to endure when it seemed impossible. The shuttle's cabin lights flickered, and Blake's thoughts were interrupted by the voice of Lieutenant Reed, his personal aide, over the comms. "Sergeant Blake, we've reviewed the training footage from the Empire. This guy's not just any soldier. He's a legend, a tactician. He's taken down entire battalions without breaking a sweat." Blake exhaled slowly, his fingers tapping on the console. "I've fought legends before, and I'm still here." Reed hesitated, then spoke with concern. "I know you faced impossible odds, sir, but this is different. The Empire doesn't just lose." Blake's gaze hardened. "Then I'll make sure they do." The journey felt endless. Every minute that passed carried with it the weight of the world's expectations. Blake's crew had trained him for combat in extreme conditions, honed his instincts for battle, and reinforced the belief that no enemy was unbeatable. But none of that could prepare him for what lay ahead. As the shuttle drew closer to the capital planet, Blake studied the data screens detailing the Empire's war machines. Massive fleets of starships that could wipe out entire cities with a single command. Ground forces that crushed opposition like insects. And Varnok himself, unparalleled in combat. It was a cold reminder that even the best soldiers weren't always enough. Hours later, the shuttle descended toward the Empire's capital, an imposing cityscape of black metal and gleaming spires. The planet's surface glowed with unnatural light, casting a dull red hue over everything. Blake's heart pounded in his chest. This was no ordinary battlefield. This was the heart of a war-hungry empire. This was where the future of humanity would be decided. He stepped onto the planet's surface, greeted not by allies or military command, but by a cold, mechanical silence. His landing zone was surrounded by tall, impassable walls, the only exit leading to an enormous arena that loomed in the distance. Varnok's challenge had not been a mere test of strength. It was a spectacle. Blake wasn't just expected to survive. He was expected to perform. And perform he would. If humanity's future was to be written, it would be done with blood, sweat, and fire. "You know what you're up against?" Reed asked over the comms, a sense of unease evident in his voice. Blake's eyes narrowed as he watched the Empire's soldiers gather in the distance, their faces unreadable. "I know," he said quietly. "And I'm still here." The time for doubts had passed. There was no room for fear. The only thing that mattered now was the fight, and Blake intended to make it one that the Empire would never forget. As he walked toward the arena, the weight of the world's expectations on his shoulders, he could hear Varnok's voice in his mind. Asterisk come, human. Show me what you're made of. Asterisk. Blake wasn't about to disappoint. Blake's boots hit the cold metal of the arena floor with a resounding thud, the sound echoing across the vast, hollow space. The crowd, an uncountable sea of alien faces, roared, their collective voice a chorus of expectation. But in the center of it all, Blake stood alone, his heart pounding with a mix of adrenaline and resolve. Across from him, Varnok towered. The champion's presence was a mountain, clad in dark, polished armor that reflected the stadium lights. He exuded an almost palpable aura of power, his eyes cold and calculating, fixed on Blake with a look that promised no mercy. The silence between them was heavy, broken only by the distant hum of the arena's machinery. It was a moment that stretched on forever. Blake's breath came in steady, controlled rhythms. He'd trained for this. Every fight, every challenge, had led him here. And still, this was different. This was not just an opponent. This was the epitome of everything humanity had been told to fear. Varnok's voice boomed across the arena, deep and commanding. I have defeated warriors from all corners of the galaxy. Your kind is no different. You will fall before me. Blake didn't flinch. He had no illusions about the enormity of this challenge. He wasn't here for words. He was here to fight. To show this empire that humans could not be written off, no matter the odds. The countdown began. 3, 2, 1. Fight. Blake moved, faster than most eyes could track. His body reacted on instinct, honed by years of combat. But even he knew this fight was unlike any other. He didn't rely solely on his strength. He knew Varnok's might, and there was no way he could match it. He would have to outsmart the giant. Varnok swung first, a brutal arc of his massive warblade designed to cleave Blake in two. Blake ducked, rolling under the blow, the sharp edge of the weapon grazing the air above him. He was on his feet again in an instant, twisting to land a quick strike to Varnok's side. It was a light blow, nothing that would do damage, but it made a point. Varnok's eyes flashed with irritation. You are fast, human, but speed cannot save you. Another swing, and Blake was forced to backpedal. He didn't have the luxury of a defensive stance. He couldn't afford to get caught by the brute force behind every strike. His mind raced, analyzing the opening in Varnok's movements. There had to be one, but where? Varnok advanced with relentless fury, pressing Blake toward the edge of the arena. The crowd's roar intensified with every attack, feeding the energy of the fight. Blake's muscles burned as he sidestepped another swing, narrowly avoiding a blow that would have decimated any lesser man. Blake's mind was clear now. The strength of the Empire's champion wasn't in his weapon or his size. It was in his predictability. Varnok expected Blake to react as every other fighter had, with hesitation, with fear. But Blake was different. He was human, and that meant he didn't think like the others. Blake lunged forward, using his small frame to duck under Varnok's next swing. In a move that would have left most warriors frozen in terror, Blake slid beneath Varnok's guard, his fingers brushing the ground for leverage. It was a gamble. Blake pushed off, launching himself at the unguarded side of Varnok's armor. He slammed his shoulder into the giant's midsection, driving his knee into the exposed gap between the plates. The impact was enough to stagger Varnok, sending him stumbling back, a rare sight. The crowd fell silent. Blake didn't wait for a second chance. He had only a moment before Varnok regained his footing. He pivoted, already calculating his next move. Every second mattered now. If he could just... Varnok's roar filled the arena. Enraged, the Empire's champion swung his war blade with a ferocity that shook the ground beneath their feet. Blake barely dodged in time, the blade slicing through the air mere inches from his body. He could feel the heat from the strike, the sheer destructive power of it. Blake's pulse raced as he dodged again, his mind narrowing to a single, razor-sharp focus. There was no room for fear. He wasn't fighting just for survival. He was fighting for something bigger, for humanity, for the future. In that moment, Blake realized something. Varnok wasn't just a warrior. He was a force of nature. But so was Blake. The crowd was on its feet, witnessing the impossible. The greatest warrior of the Galactic Empire, and the human who would not be crushed. The duel had only just begun. Blake's chest heaved with each ragged breath, his body screaming in protest after every move. His arm burned, his legs were jelly, but he kept moving. Varnok loomed in front of him, a towering, relentless juggernaut who seemed impervious to pain or fatigue. The warrior's war blade gleamed menacingly in his grip, and Blake knew one misstep would end it all. But he wasn't backing down. Varnok smiled, a cold, knowing expression. You fight well, human. But this is where it ends. Blake barely registered the words. His mind was too focused on survival. Every strike Varnok made was calculated, precise. Yet Blake had already seen the pattern. The giant was predictable. And for all his strength, Varnok was starting to show cracks. His movements weren't as sharp as before. His breath came harder. The longer this dragged on, the more his arrogance worked against him. Blake knew he couldn't keep dodging forever. He had to take the initiative. He had to give Varnok something to fear. The crowd was watching, silent now, as the two combatants circled each other. The tension was thick enough to slice through. A bead of sweat trickled down Blake's brow, but his resolve didn't waver. His gaze locked on Varnok's chest, where the plating around his ribcage was slightly loose, just enough to give Blake a sliver of an opening. Blake darted forward, feinting left before cutting sharply to the right. Varnok's massive warblade swung through the air in a wide arc, narrowly missing its mark. Blake's fist connected with the exposed gap in the armor, a solid, powerful strike. Varnok staggered back, momentarily off balance, a flicker of surprise in his eyes. The crowd gasped. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Blake could feel the tides shifting. Varnok was faltering, just for an instant. And that was all Blake needed. The giant roared in fury, launching himself at Blake with the full force of a galaxy's worth of arrogance behind him. But this time, Blake was ready. He sidestepped, using Varnok's momentum against him, and sent the warrior crashing into the arena wall with a sickening thud. Dust and debris scattered through the air, and for a moment, the arena was eerily quiet. Varnok stood, slower than before, his armor scratched, his breathing labored. "You think this changes anything, human?" His voice was filled with a dangerous calm. Blake didn't answer. He didn't need to. Every movement was a statement of defiance. He wasn't just a soldier. He was humanity's fist, raised in defiance against a force that had come to conquer and destroy. Blake's hands were slick with sweat, but he gripped his weapon tighter, his mind sharpening. The fight was no longer just about survival. It was about proving something. Humanity wasn't weak. Humanity could stand toe-to-toe with the greatest warriors in the galaxy and win. Varnok growled and swung again. But Blake was faster, closing the gap before the blade could make its mark. This time he didn't dodge. He struck. His fist connected with Varnok's side, slipping through the crack in the armor and striking directly at the exposed ribs. The giant grunted, his expression shifting from arrogance to something Blake hadn't seen before, uncertainty. Blake took advantage of the opening, landing another punch, then another. Each strike was fueled by years of training, by every battle Blake had fought, by every wound he had healed. Varnok's massive body staggered back again, but this time he didn't recover as quickly. His movements were slower, his stance less firm. For the first time in this fight, Blake saw it, doubt. Varnok's eyes narrowed, but Blake could see the change. The confidence that had defined the Empire's champion was crumbling. This cannot be," Varnok muttered, almost to himself. Blake didn't hesitate. He pressed the advantage, keeping up the relentless assault. He wasn't just fighting for himself anymore. He was fighting for humanity, for Earth, for everyone who had ever been told they were insignificant in the face of the stars. Varnok's warblade raised one last time, but this time it wasn't with the same certainty. Blake closed in before Varnok could strike, his movements a blur of speed and power. In a fluid motion, Blake twisted, driving his knee into the giant's side and delivering a decisive blow that sent Varnok crashing to the ground. The arena went deathly silent. Blake stood over the fallen warrior, chest heaving, the weight of the moment settling in. He had done it. The Empire's greatest champion lay at his feet, and Blake had not just survived. He had triumphed. The silence was broken by the crowd's roar, a deafening wave of shock and awe. The battle was far from over, but for now, Blake had shown the galaxy what humanity was capable of. Blake stood in the center of the arena, chest heaving, his body drenched in sweat, his mind still processing what had just happened. Varnok, the greatest warrior of the Galactic Empire, was on the ground at his feet, defeated. The air felt thick with disbelief, and the crowd, a sea of alien faces, fell into stunned silence. For a moment, it felt as if time had stopped. Blake didn't move. He didn't even breathe. He was waiting for the inevitable response, the fury of an empire whose champion had just been humbled by a human. But what came next wasn't rage. It was something worse. From the shadows, a figure stepped forward, a tall, imposing leader whose presence seemed to swallow the space around him. His eyes glowed with an unsettling, cold light, and his armor gleamed with the insignia of the Empire. He was not here to fight. He was here to declare something far more dangerous. You think this victory means anything, human? The leader's voice was low and commanding, a tone that sent a chill through Blake's bones. You have not won. You have only drawn our attention. Blake's hand tightened around his weapon, but he didn't speak. He didn't need to. The leader's words, though chilling, were a confirmation of what Blake already knew. The fight had just begun. The leader continued, his voice like ice. Varnok was the pride of our empire, and now you've proven that your species is capable of defeating him. That is a mistake. Blake's pulse quickened. He had expected retaliation, but this was a threat that ran deeper, one that made the ground beneath his feet feel unstable. He had no illusions about the power the Empire wielded, but now, for the first time, Blake felt the full weight of what he had just done. The leader raised a hand, signaling to the vast, silent crowd. You humans think you have won something, but there is a price for every action. The arena erupted with sound again, not the cheering Blake had hoped for, but a chorus of growls and growls, voices laced with malice. In that instant, he knew the truth. This wasn't a fight just for survival. It was a war, one Blake had just ignited by toppling their champion. You've ignited something that cannot be undone, the leader said, his voice a cold whisper that carried across the arena. We do not forget those who embarrass us. Blake stood his ground. His muscles burned from the fight, his vision blurred from exhaustion, but the fire in his chest burned brighter than ever. He wasn't just fighting for his life anymore. He was fighting for Earth's future. You might think you can intimidate me, but you can't undo what's been done, Blake shot back. I've faced worse than your threats. Your empire might be big, but it's no match for the human spirit. The leader's eyes flickered with something, amusement, perhaps. Then you will learn just how far your spirit can carry you. The arena's gates slammed shut, sealing Blake inside. From every corner, armored soldiers began to flood the space, their footsteps in perfect synchrony, their weapons drawn. Blake's heart pounded in his chest. They were not here to honor him. They were here to destroy him. But Blake didn't back down. He wasn't alone. The knowledge of humanity's strength surged through him. The lessons, the battles, the triumphs. He wasn't just a soldier. He was a symbol of everything Earth had fought for, and he would show the galaxy what that truly meant. The leader gave a final, cruel smile. Prepare yourself, human. You will learn that even a single victory comes at a steep price. With that, the soldiers closed in. Blake moved, the rage of millions of humans filling his veins. He couldn't win this fight with sheer strength. But he didn't need to. He only needed to survive. And as long as he drew breath, he would keep fighting. For humanity. As the first soldier lunged at him, Blake's instincts kicked in. His mind raced, calculating the moves, anticipating the next strike. He dodged, countered, and fought with the fury of a species that had refused to be crushed by the weight of the stars. This wasn't just about the duel anymore. This was the beginning of humanity's war with an empire that had underestimated them. And Blake would make sure they never forgot the price of that mistake. Blake's breath came in jagged gasps, his body bruised and bloodied from the relentless assault. The Empire's soldiers were relentless. Wave after wave of perfectly coordinated attacks that tested every limit of his strength. His movements were becoming slower, his vision darker, but still he fought on. He had no choice. Around him, the arena was chaos. The metallic walls reverberated with the clashing sounds of combat as the remaining soldiers closed in. Blake's every move was calculated, every strike a desperate attempt to hold the line. His mind screamed at him to keep moving, to keep fighting, but fatigue was catching up. The sting of every wound was a reminder of how close he was to the edge. But the worst part? The worst part was the silence that came after each fall. When one soldier went down, another took their place. And behind them all, watching with impassive eyes, stood the leader, the one who had warned him of the consequences. "You should have stayed down, human," the leader's voice echoed across the battlefield. He was watching Blake with the same cold amusement as before, his expression unchanged by the slaughter around him. Blake didn't answer. There were no words that could capture the defiance he felt, the burning need to protect his world. He couldn't let Earth become just another footnote in the Empire's history. He had already taken down their champion. He wasn't about to let this empire break him. Just then, the ground trembled. Blake's heart skipped a beat as he looked up, sensing the shift in the arena. The massive gates to the arena swung open with a thunderous crash, and from the shadows emerged something far worse than what he had already faced. The Empire's reinforcements. But this time, they weren't soldiers. A hulking figure, armored in dark, gleaming plates, stepped forward, a warrior unlike any Blake had seen before. This was not a soldier. This was a machine of war, a living weapon designed to crush anything in its path. Blake's hands tightened around his weapon, his body instinctively preparing for what was coming. The massive warrior locked eyes with him, its movements slow but deliberate, calculating the distance. The figure raised a blade, longer than any weapon Blake had encountered, its edges glowing with a cold, otherworldly energy. "You were the one who defeated Varnok." The voice was mechanical, distorted, but the question was clear. It was not asking for an answer. It was a challenge. Blake had no time to think. He had to act. With a primal roar, he charged, his body fueled by nothing but sheer will. The world seemed to slow as he closed the distance, every muscle screaming in protest. His weapon clashed against the giant's blade in a shower of sparks, the force nearly knocking him off his feet. For a moment, Blake felt the weight of his own body, as if the air itself was pressing against him. The warrior's blade was a force of nature, cutting through the space with devastating precision. Blake dodged, barely avoiding a fatal strike, but the warrior was relentless. Each attack was faster than the last, and Blake's movements grew more desperate. But even in this madness, something inside him, something human, refused to let go. He was not just fighting for survival anymore. He was fighting for the future of his people, for Earth, for everything that had brought him here. The tide of battle seemed to turn in his favor when, with a burst of energy, Blake knocked the massive warrior's blade aside, finding an opening. He lunged forward, using all his strength to drive his weapon into the warrior's chest. The sound of metal scraping against metal was deafening, but Blake didn't let go. The warrior let out a mechanical hiss, its body jerking in a final, violent spasm before collapsing to the ground. Blake fell to his knees, every inch of his body screaming in agony. He couldn't keep going. He had done it. He had survived. But at what cost? His vision blurred, and the weight of what had just transpired began to sink in. He had taken down the Empire's greatest warrior. He had survived their onslaught. But humanity's price had already been paid. The leader stepped forward, his eyes filled with something darker than before. There was no victory in this. Blake had proven humanity's strength, but in doing so, he had exposed Earth to the wrath of a galactic empire. And now, the real fight was about to begin. Blake was too tired to stand, but his resolve remained unbroken. Earth had won this battle, but the war was far from over. And no matter what came next, Blake would fight until the very end.